the tragic rise of the Singer empire, and the tower built on sewing machines. Picture this, it is the year 1908, and you are standing at the corner of Broadway and Liberty Street in the heart of Manhattan, your neck craning upward as your eyes trace the impossible height of a building that seems to pierce the very clouds themselves. 47 stories of red brick, steel, and terracotta rising 612 feet into the New York sky, crowned with an ornate mansard roof that makes the whole structure look like some kind of architectural wedding cake designed by gods who had never heard the word impossible. This is the Singer Building, and for one glorious year, it holds the title of the tallest building on the face of the earth. But here is the thing that should make you stop and really think about what you are witnessing. This entire monument to human ambition, this tower that dominates the skyline of the greatest city in the world, this structure that represents the cutting edge of architectural achievement, all of it, every single brick and beam and pane of glass, was paid for by sewing machines. Not oil, not steel, not railroads or banking or any of the industries you might expect to generate this kind of astronomical wealth. Sewing machines, those humble contraptions that sat in parlors and workshops around the world, the ones your grandmother might have used to hem curtains or patch trousers. And the story of how a sewing machine company came to build the tallest building in the world is one of the most remarkable and ultimately tragic tales in American business history. A story of genius and scandal, of innovation and exploitation, of an empire that rose to unimaginable heights before crashing down in ways that nobody could have predicted. To understand how we got to that gleaming tower in Manhattan, we need to go back to the beginning, to a cold October day in 1811 when Isaac Merritt Singer was born in a small town called Pittstown in upstate New York. And right from the start, you can see that this was not going to be an ordinary life. His parents were German immigrants, his father a millwright who moved the family around constantly looking for work, and by the time Isaac was 10 years old, his mother had abandoned the family entirely. 2 years later, at the age of 12, Isaac Singer ran away from home and never looked back. Now think about that for a moment, a 12-year-old boy alone in early 19th century America. No money, no connections, no safety net of any kind, and yet somehow this child would go on to build one of the most successful companies in human history. But the path to get there was anything but straight. For the next 2 decades, Isaac Singer drifted through life like a man searching for something he could not quite name. He worked as a laborer, as a machinist, as an apprentice in various trades, but his true passion, the thing that really set his soul on fire, was the theater. Isaac Singer wanted to be an actor. He joined traveling theater companies, adopted the stage name Isaac Merritt, and spent years touring the country performing in whatever productions would have him. And here is where we start to see the traits that would later define his business career, because by all accounts, Isaac Singer was absolutely magnetic. He was tall, over 6 feet, with a commanding presence and a voice that could fill any room. He had charisma to burn, the kind of personality that drew people in and made them want to follow him, trust him, believe in whatever he was selling. He was also, as we will discover, a man of enormous appetites and absolutely zero moral restraint, but we will get to that later. The acting career never quite took off in the way Singer hoped, and by his late 30s, he found himself back in the world of machinery, working in a shop in Boston and tinkering with various inventions. He had actually patented a few things already, including a machine for carving wooden type and a rock drilling machine, but none of them had made him rich. And then, in 1850, fate intervened in the form of a broken sewing machine. A customer had brought one of the early sewing machines into the shop for repairs, and Singer took one look at this contraption and saw immediately what was wrong with it. Not just what was broken, but what was fundamentally flawed about the entire design. The existing sewing machines of that era were finicky, unreliable, complicated to operate, and prone to constant breakdowns. They worked horizontally, the fabric had to be fed through in awkward ways, and they were more trouble than they were worth for most people. Singer looked at this machine and said, in essence, I can do better. Now here is where we need to pause and address something important, because when most people hear the name Singer, they assume he invented the sewing machine. He absolutely did not. The sewing machine had been developed over decades by numerous inventors, with a man named Elias Howe generally credited with patenting the first practical lock-stitch sewing machine back in 1846. What Singer did was take the existing technology and make it actually work for regular people. Over the course of 11 days, working around the clock in a frenzy of creative energy, Isaac Singer redesigned the sewing machine from the ground up. He made it operate with a foot pedal, freeing up both hands to guide the fabric. He added a rigid arm to hold the needle. He designed a presser foot to hold the fabric in place. He created a mechanism that allowed the needle to move up and down in a straight vertical motion. Every single one of these innovations seems obvious in hindsight, but at the time they were revolutionary. By the end of those 11 days, Singer had created a sewing machine that actually worked reliably, that ordinary people could learn to operate, that was practical for home use. And that, more than anything else, is what would change the world. But Isaac Singer was a genius inventor, not a businessman, and he knew it. Which is why the most important decision he ever made was partnering with a man named Edward Clark. Now if Singer was the fire, Clark was the ice. A lawyer by training, methodical and precise where Singer was impulsive and dramatic, Clark looked at Singer's invention and saw not just a machine, but an empire waiting to be built. The two men formed the I.M. Singer and Company in 1851, with Clark handling the business side while Singer focused on manufacturing and improving the product. And almost immediately, they faced a crisis that threatened to destroy everything before it even began. Remember Elias Howe, the man who had patented the lock-stitch mechanism back in 1846? Well, he took one look at Singer's new sewing machine and said, "Excuse me, that is my patent you are using." And he was right. Singer's machine, for all its innovations, still used the fundamental lock-stitch mechanism that Howe had patented. What followed was one of the most vicious patent wars in American industrial history, with Howe suing Singer and several other sewing machine manufacturers. Lawyers making fortunes while the actual inventors battled it out in court, and the whole industry threatening to collapse under the weight of litigation. The resolution came in 1856 with the formation of something called the Sewing Machine Combination, essentially a patent pool where all the major patent holders agreed to share their technologies and split the licensing fees. It was one of the first arrangements of its kind in American business, and it allowed the sewing machine industry to finally move forward. Howe got his royalties, Singer got to keep manufacturing, and Edward Clark got to focus on what he did best, which was selling machines in ways that nobody had ever thought of before. This is where the Singer story goes from interesting to genuinely revolutionary, because Edward Clark essentially invented modern consumer marketing. Think about the challenge he faced. Here you have this sewing machine that costs somewhere between $75 and $125. For context, that was roughly equivalent to 3 or 4 months' wages for an average working family in the 1850s. It would be like trying to sell a $5,000 or $6,000 appliance today. Nobody has that kind of money lying around, especially not the working-class families who would benefit most from having a sewing machine. So what did Clark do? He invented the installment plan. Buy now, pay later. Put down $5 and pay the rest in monthly installments. It sounds so obvious to us now. We live in a world of credit cards and financing and buy now, pay later apps. But in the 1850s, this was absolutely unheard of for consumer goods. Rich people bought things outright. Poor people did without. That was just how the world worked. Clark looked at that reality and said, "No, we are going to create a new way of doing business." But he did not stop there. Clark also pioneered the trade-in program, where customers could bring in their old sewing machines, regardless of brand, and receive credit toward a new Singer machine. He established a network of company-owned showrooms, staffed by salesmen trained not just to sell machines, but to demonstrate them, to teach customers how to use them, to provide service and support after the sale. He hired women as demonstrators, which was radical for the time, reasoning correctly that women would be more comfortable learning to use a sewing machine from another woman. He invested heavily in advertising, spending more money on marketing than any company in history up to that point, plastering the Singer name on billboards and newspapers and magazines around the world. And he expanded internationally, establishing factories and sales offices in Europe, South America, Asia. Everywhere there were people who wore clothes, which was everywhere. By the 1880s, Singer was selling more sewing machines than all its competitors combined, and it was the first truly global consumer brand, recognized from New York to London to Tokyo to Buenos Aires. And here is where the story takes its first dark turn, because while Edward Clark was building an empire, Isaac Singer was destroying his personal life with the enthusiasm of a man actively trying to set fire to everything he touched. We mentioned earlier that Singer was a man of enormous appetites, and we were not exaggerating. Over the course of his life, Isaac Singer fathered at least 24 children by at least 5 different women, often maintaining multiple households simultaneously. He was legally married to one woman while openly living with another, had children with both of them, and then started relationships with several more women on the side. In an era when public morality mattered enormously, when reputation was everything, Singer was spectacularly, almost defiantly scandalous. And in 1860, it all came crashing down in the most public and humiliating way possible. Singer was riding in his carriage down Fifth Avenue with one of his mistresses when he happened to spot another one of his mistresses walking on the street. Being Isaac Singer, he did not simply look away or pretend not to notice. Instead, he leaped out of the carriage and attacked the woman on the street, beating her in full view of dozens of witnesses. The scandal was immediate and devastating. Newspapers covered the story with barely concealed glee. His various mistresses and wives began comparing notes and discovering the full extent of his deceptions, and Isaac Singer found himself facing multiple legal actions and complete social ruin. His solution was to flee the country entirely. He moved first to Paris, then to England, where he built an enormous estate called the Wigwam and lived out the remainder of his life in ostentatious luxury, surrounded by his extended and complicated family. He died in 1875 at the age of 63, leaving behind a personal fortune estimated at around $13 million, but his relationship with the company he had founded was essentially over. Edward Clark, the quiet lawyer who had always operated in Singer's shadow, was now fully in control. And it was Edward Clark, and then his heirs and successors, who would take Singer to heights that Isaac himself could never have imagined. Through the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, the Singer Manufacturing Company became something unprecedented in the history of capitalism. It was not just the largest sewing machine company in the world, it was one of the largest companies of any kind anywhere. It had factories on multiple continents, a sales force that numbered in the tens of thousands, and brand recognition that extended to the remotest corners of the globe. The Singer name appeared on machines in Indian villages and African trading posts and Chinese workshops. It was sewn into the fabric of daily life for hundreds of millions of people who had never heard of New York or Broadway or any of the places where the company's executives made their decisions. And all of this success generated wealth on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, wealth that demanded expression, that demanded a monument worthy of the empire that had created it. Which brings us back to that tower on Broadway, because by the early 1900s, Singer needed a new headquarters, and the man in charge of building it was determined to make a statement. The company hired architect Ernest Flagg, a Beaux Arts-trained designer who had studied in Paris and absorbed the grand architectural traditions of Europe. Flagg was given an unusual brief: design a building that would be both practical and symbolic, that would serve as functional office space while also advertising the global reach and power of the Singer brand. And Flagg responded with something genuinely revolutionary. Most tall buildings of that era were essentially boxes, utilitarian structures designed to maximize rentable floor space. Flagg took a different approach. He designed a building in 2 parts, a lower base of 14 stories that filled the entire lot, and then a soaring tower that rose another 33 stories above that. The tower was slender and elegant, tapering slightly as it rose, crowned with that distinctive mansard roof that made it instantly recognizable from miles away. The exterior was clad in red brick with terracotta ornaments, giving it a warmth and elegance that the steel and glass boxes of later decades would lack. And at 612 feet, it was the tallest building in the world when it opened in 1908, surpassing the previous record holder by over 100 feet. The Singer building was not just tall, it was beautiful in a way that tall buildings rarely were. Flagg had fought against the trend of purely utilitarian skyscraper design, and the Singer building was his manifesto made physical. Every detail was considered, from the ornate lobby with its marble walls and bronze fixtures to the observation deck at the top where visitors could look out over the entire city. The building became an instant landmark, a symbol of New York's status as the commercial capital of the world. Postcards featuring the Singer building were sent by the millions. Its silhouette appeared in advertisements and artwork. For a generation of Americans, the Singer building was what they thought of when they imagined New York City. But here is where the tragedy begins to unfold, because the Singer building held its title as the world's tallest for less than a year. In 1909, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower surpassed it, rising to 700 feet. A few years later, the Woolworth Building went even higher, to 792 feet. The race to the sky was accelerating, and the Singer Building, for all its elegance, was quickly becoming just one tall building among many. And then came the changes that would ultimately doom it. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the Singer Company remained enormously successful, but the world around it was changing. Electric sewing machines began replacing the old mechanical ones. Competition from Japanese and European manufacturers intensified. The company's dominance, which had once seemed unassailable, began slowly eroding. The Second World War brought a temporary reprieve, as Singer's factories were converted to war production, turning out everything from artillery fuses to aircraft components. But after the war, the old challenges returned in force. The American consumer market was changing. Women who had worked in factories during the war were not as interested in home sewing as their mothers and grandmothers had been. Ready-made clothing was becoming cheaper and more available. The sewing machine, which had once been an essential household tool, was increasingly becoming a specialty item. Singer tried to adapt, diversifying into other products, but the company was built around sewing machines, and sewing machines were slowly becoming obsolete. And then there was the building itself. By the 1960s, the Singer Building was showing its age. Its systems were outdated, its floor plans were inefficient by modern standards, and it sat on some of the most valuable real estate in Manhattan. The economics were brutal. The building was worth more as a hole in the ground than as a functioning office tower. The land beneath it could support something much larger and more profitable. And so, in 1967, United States Steel bought the Singer Building and announced plans to demolish it and replace it with a new corporate headquarters. The decision sparked protests and outrage. Architectural critics and preservationists argued that the Singer Building was a masterpiece, one of the finest examples of Beaux Arts skyscraper design in existence. They pointed out that its demolition would represent the destruction of a piece of history that could never be replaced. But the economics were the economics. The Singer Building was worth more dead than alive, and in American capitalism, that is ultimately the only argument that matters. The demolition began in 1968 and took nearly 2 years to complete. It remains, to this day, the tallest building ever peacefully demolished. The process was agonizing to watch for those who loved the building. Workers took it apart piece by piece, floor by floor, like surgeons performing an operation that they knew would kill the patient. The ornate terracotta decorations were smashed into rubble. The elegant bronze fixtures were melted down for scrap. The lobby with its marble walls was gutted and destroyed. By 1970, the Singer Building was gone, replaced by a flat plaza that would eventually become the site of One Liberty Plaza, a black steel and glass box that has precisely none of the character or beauty of the building it replaced. And here is the tragic irony that haunts the whole story. The demolition of the Singer Building helped spark the historic preservation movement in New York City. The outrage over its destruction led directly to stronger preservation laws, to the designation of landmarks, to a new consciousness about the value of historic buildings. The Singer Building died so that other buildings might live, but it did not have to die. If the preservation laws that its destruction inspired had existed a few years earlier, the Singer Building would still be standing today, one of the great treasures of New York architecture. Instead, it exists only in photographs and memories, a ghost building that haunts the skyline it once dominated. But the tragedy of Singer extends beyond just the building. The company itself was on a slow decline that would eventually end in total collapse. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Singer tried desperately to reinvent itself. It sold off divisions, acquired other companies, diversified into aerospace and defense and furniture, and a dozen other industries that had nothing to do with sewing machines. The Singer name still had value, still meant something to millions of people around the world, but the company behind the name was increasingly lost, increasingly directionless. In 1987, the Singer Company was taken over in a corporate raid by Paul Bilzerian, a financier who would later go to prison for securities fraud. He stripped the company of assets, sold off profitable divisions, loaded it with debt, and left it a hollow shell. Singer limped along for another decade, before finally declaring bankruptcy in 1999. The brand itself survived, sold off to various owners who licensed the Singer name for sewing machines manufactured mostly in Asia. You can still buy a Singer sewing machine today, and the brand still carries some of that old cachet, that sense of quality and reliability that was built up over more than a century. But the company, the real Singer, the industrial empire that once circled the globe and employed hundreds of thousands of people and built the tallest building in the world, that Singer is gone. It exists now only in history books and corporate archives, a cautionary tale about how even the mightiest enterprises can fall. And what are we supposed to take away from this story? What is the lesson of Singer and its tower? Part of it is about the nature of progress itself. Isaac Singer did not invent the sewing machine, but he made it work. He took an idea that had been floating around for decades and turned it into something practical, something that ordinary people could use in their daily lives. That combination of technical skill and practical vision is rare and valuable, and it can create enormous wealth when it is combined with business genius like Edward Clark's. But progress does not stand still. The same forces of innovation that created Singer would eventually make it obsolete. The company that had revolutionized the garment industry would be left behind as the industry continued to evolve. The building that had reached for the sky would be torn down to make room for something newer and taller. Part of the lesson is about the nature of capitalism itself, its creative and destructive energies, its ability to build monuments to human achievement and then knock them down when the numbers no longer work. The Singer building was demolished not because it had failed, but because its success was not sufficient. It was not generating enough profit from its land, not keeping up with the relentless demand for more, always more. That same logic would eventually destroy the company that built it, as corporate raiders and short-term thinkers extracted every last bit of value from an enterprise that had taken generations to build. And part of the lesson is personal about Isaac Singer himself. Here was a man of genuine genius, a man who could look at a broken machine and see how to fix not just that machine, but the entire concept it represented. But he was also a man incapable of controlling his own appetites, incapable of building anything lasting in his personal life, even as he helped create an industrial empire. He fathered 24 children and abandoned most of them. He accumulated millions of dollars and spent his final years in exile, running from the scandals he had created. His name is on buildings and machines around the world, but what do we actually remember about him? The affairs, the beatings, the abandoned families. The genius gets lost in the wreckage of the personal life. Edward Clark, by contrast, is almost forgotten today, even though he was in many ways the true architect of the Singer empire. He took Singer's invention and built a modern corporation around it. He invented marketing techniques that are still used today. He established the global infrastructure that made Singer a household name on every continent. And he used his wealth to build things that lasted, including the Dakota apartment building in New York, one of the first luxury apartment buildings in the city, which still stands today as one of the most prestigious addresses in Manhattan. Clark understood something that Singer never did. That wealth is meaningless unless you use it to create something durable, something that will outlast you. Singer spent his money on mansions and mistresses and left behind scandals. Clark spent his money on buildings and institutions and left behind a legacy. The Singer building is gone, torn down more than 50 years ago, and most people today have never heard of it. But for one brief shining moment in 1908, it represented everything that American capitalism could achieve. It was beautiful and bold and confident, a tower built on sewing machines that reached higher than any building in human history. It stood at the corner of Broadway and Liberty Street and proclaimed to the world that anything was possible, that a runaway child from upstate New York could grow up to change how the entire world makes clothing, that a humble household appliance could generate enough wealth to reshape the skyline of the greatest city on earth. That building is gone now, and the company that built it is gone, and Isaac Singer has been dead for almost 150 years. But the story endures because it tells us something essential about the American experience, about the heights we can reach and the falls we inevitably take, about the monuments we build and the monuments we destroy, about the tragic impermanence of even our greatest achievements. The Singer building was the tallest in the world for less than a year, and it existed for only 60 years total. That seems impossibly brief, a blink of an eye in the grand sweep of history. But for the people who saw it, who worked in it, who looked up at it from the streets of Manhattan and felt that surge of wonder and possibility, it was eternal. It was proof that the impossible could become possible, that sewing machines could build towers, that a country barely a century old could reach for the sky and grasp it. And maybe that is the final lesson of Singer and its tower. Nothing lasts forever, not buildings, not companies, not empires, not even the memory of the people who built them. But the reaching matters. The ambition matters. The attempt to build something larger than yourself, something that transcends your own brief existence, that matters even if it all comes crashing down in the end. Isaac Singer was a deeply flawed man who helped change the world. Edward Clark was a quiet lawyer who built an empire on the foundation Singer provided. Ernest Flagg was an architect who believed that beauty mattered even in commercial buildings. And for one glorious year, their combined efforts produced the tallest building the world had ever seen, a tower of red brick and terracotta that rose from the streets of Manhattan and announced to everyone who saw it that the future had arrived. That tower is gone now, but its story remains, a reminder of what we can build and what we can lose, of the heights we reach and the depths to which we fall, of the tragic impermanence of all human endeavor and the glory we achieve along the way. The Singer building was demolished in 1968, but in some ways it never really fell. It lives on in the buildings that were saved because its destruction taught us the value of preservation. It lives on in the marketing techniques that Edward Clark pioneered and that every company in the world still uses. It lives on in the sewing machines that still bear the Singer name, humming away in workshops and homes around the globe. And it lives on in stories like this one, stories that remember what was lost and try to make sense of why, stories that look up at the sky and imagine the tower that once stood there, reaching for heaven on a foundation of thread and needles, and the impossible dreams of a runaway boy from upstate New York who wanted to change the world and somehow, against all odds, actually did.